Okay. Wow. So today's chapter has a lot of information. It speaks about all different types of objects and materials. And the key theme of today's chapter is really that what you do with something will affect its value and its significance. Its function affects its significance, which certainly is a lesson for us in our service of Hashem, that it's up to us to determine the significance and value of everything that we have, of all the assets that we have. If we use it towards a holy cause, then it gains more significance, and vice versa. This is going to be a theme that the Rambam will apply to maybe about 100 different types of objects and materials. There's about, I think, 28 halachas, and we've got about 28 minutes, so we'll see if we could get through them to the best of our ability. So here's a list on the left, but I shouldn't forget to do what I have been doing. We're in the third volume of the Rambam, the Book of Times, and within the Book of Zmanim, we are in the first section, Shabbos, which is a huge section of the Rambam. It's got, I think, 30 chapters. We're on chapter 18. And this would be a summary of today's Rambam, all the different materials and the measurements for each one in order for a person to be liable. So as we mentioned, the only time a person is considered to have violated the Shabbos is if he does the melacha in the way that it is usually done. And so too when it comes to carrying, if a person transfers an article from one domain to another in the way that it is usually transported or transferred, then he is liable. Now, what would be the amount or the quantity or the measurements of different articles in order for it to be carried in there in a significant amount? So that's what the Rambam will be discussing today. Okay, starting with food. The person who transfers an article from a private domain into the public domain or from the public domain into the private domain is not liable unless he transfers an amount that will be beneficial to accomplish a purpose. The following are the minimum amounts for which one is liable for transferring. Human food, if your person was to transfer an apple, or how about a chocolate chip cookie, or whatever it might be, a chip. So the size of a dried fig. Dried fig is, I think, approximately, it's a little bit more than a kazayis. So we're talking around 30 grams or so, or more or less. Somewhere between, I would say, about 20 to 30 grams. If it was less than that amount, then you've carried an irregular amount, and so you wouldn't be biblically liable. It would only be rabbinically forbidden. So if somebody, for example, was walking out the house, they're at their holiday home, wherever it may be, or on holiday, wherever it may be, whether it be at the Val or in Pletz or in Michalisburg, and there's no Erev, and they decide to go for a walk, and they discover that in their pockets, they have a little bit of food. There's some sweets, some Mentos, or some chips. So did that person just break Shabbos unintentionally? So it will depend how much he was carrying. So if he was carrying the amount of a dried fig, then that is what's considered the minimum amount of food. Less than that, one would not be biblically viable, and when Mashiach comes, would not have to bring an offering. This quantity may include a combination of different types of foods. If he had inside of his pocket, or pocket sounds a little awful for food, but if he had whatever it was, even in his hand, he just took a stroll outside and he didn't realize he was holding on to a few different foods together, maybe a chip, and together with that a slice of carrots and maybe a grape, whatever it is. If all the foods together add up to the amount of a dried fig, then he is liable. The shells, the seeds, the stems, and the chaff and the bran would not be included because that's not edible. The minimum measure for which one is liable for transferring wine is a quarter of a revius. So a revius is 86, so divided that by 4 is approximately 21.5 ml of wine. That's a very small amount. So if you have less than 21.5 mil, then you wouldn't have violated. If it has congealed, so it's become hard, then it's already a food, or it's used for some other function, and then it would be a kazayis. Milk, if it's a kosher animal, which means that the milk is drinking, then it would be a gulp of milk. Non-kosher animal, which could not be drinking, it would be enough to apply it to one's eye. Apparently, milk was used as eye ointments. For women's milk or egg white, enough to be put in an ointment. For oil, enough to anoint the small toe of a newborn infant. Dew, enough to serve as a base for an eye ointment. Fascinating. An eye ointment, enough to be mixed with water and be applied to an eye. Water, enough for washing the surface of a mortar. So it's a very small amount of water. Honey, enough to apply to a wound. Some people, according to some of the commentaries, if a person actually had an amputated limb, they would apply honey and that would help. So the amount that honey necessary for that would already make a person liable. Blood and all other liquids and all sewage water are revius. That's the standard measurement for liquids, which is about 86 mil, according to Reb Chaim Dah. So that was as far as foods and a whole lot of other foods are concerned. What about animal foods? So straw from grain would be a cow's mouthful, because that's what cows eat. Straw from beans, a camel's mouthful. Well, if one is transferring bean straw with the purpose of feeding it to a cow, although usually you wouldn't, because it's not the best food for your cow, so I wouldn't recommend you serving your cow some bean straw. I don't know how it goes with dogs. Then one is liable for transferring a cow's mouthful, because once you've decided that you're using it for that purpose, then it takes on that measurement. Eating that involves difficulty is still considered to be eating. Straws from the ears of grain, a lamb's mouthful. That's what you would serve to your lamb. Grass, a kid, meaning a baby goat's mouthful. Leaves of garlic and leaves of onion. If they're fresh, then you follow human consumption. And that would be a dried fig. If they are dry, that's animal food. And so you would go by a baby goat's mouthful. Should one take out a combination of a few different substances, then you wouldn't go by what makes you more liable, but what makes you less liable. So what does that mean? If a person took out both grain straw and bean straw, so if it's enough to fill a cow's mouth, then he's still not liable, because a cow generally doesn't eat bean straw. So since there's some bean straw in there, then you would follow the larger amount, which is enough to fill a camel's mouth. Same applies regarding all other dimensions in Shabbos. Okay, the minimum measurement for which one is liable for transferring wood is the amount necessary to cook a portion of a chicken's egg, the size of a dried fig. So enough wood to cook a little egg, a little bit of egg, where the egg is beaten and mixed with oil and placed in a pot. The person who transfers a reed is liable when it is large enough to make a pen that reaches to the top of his fingers. If, however, the reed is thick or crushed and thus unfit as a pen, then you would follow the same measurement as wood. It could only be used for fuel. The minimum measure for which one is liable to transfer for transferring spices is the amount necessary to spice an egg. Different spices would combine. Pepper, even the slightest amount of pepper already is of benefit. Pine sap, even the slightest amount. Pleasant fragrances, the slightest amount. Unpleasant fragrances, also the slightest amount, because even the slightest amount of something that's generating an unpleasant odor is significant enough that you would want to leave the room, or you'd want it out of the room. So that makes it significant. Perfumes, even the slightest amount. Fine purpled dye, again, it gave some positive odor, I think. Fragrance, even the slightest amount. Rosebuds, one rosebud is already significant. Okay, if it's a piece of metal, like bronze or iron, again, even the slightest amount can already be used for crushing spices. Chips of stones from the altar, which is holy, or earth of the altar, or shemus, decayed strolls, or wrapping cloths like the mantle of a Torah. Again, the slightest amount would have to be buried, and that means that even the slightest amount is significant. Coal, even the slightest amount. A flame you're not liable for. A flame is not considered substantial enough to be considered carrying, actually. So you wouldn't be liable for the fire, only for the coal that's holding the fire. Person who transfers seeds of plants, which you cannot eat, is liable for transferring enough which is almost the size of a dried fig. That would be a significant amount of seeds for planting. But if it's a cucumber seed or gourds or Egyptian beans, then even 2 seeds or 5 seeds would be enough. Person who transfers coarse bran would be enough to place on the opening of the crucible of a gold refiner. He uses coarse bran in the process of refining the gold. Fine bran, so then it would depend on what his intention is. If he intends to use it as food, then it would be a dried fig. If he intends to use it as human food, if he plans on using it as animal food, it would be a kid's mouth. If he's planning on using it to paint, enough to paint a small cloth. The buds of shrubs and carobs that have not yet become sweet. Again, that is what people eat, the size of a dried fig. But once they become sweet, then I guess people don't eat them, interestingly, and then it would be enough for the mouth of a kid. Luff, mustard, turmeric, and all other foods that are pickled, whether they're sweet or not, would be a dried fig, because at that point they are intended to be eaten by people. Okay, seeds, back to seeds. If it's to eat, then 5 seeds is already considered a nice snack. If his intent is to use them as fuel for fire, then you would follow the measurements of wood. For counting, 2 people would use seeds to count back in the day before they had calculators. Similarly, the measure for which a person is liable for hyssop depends on his intent. If his intent is to eat it, then it would be a dried fig. If his intent is to give it to animals, a kid's mouthful. If his intention is to use it as fuel, then you would follow the volume of fuel. What about shells? Nut shells, pomegranate shells, isatis, pua. The commentaries discuss different types of dyes or shells. If it's enough to dye a small garment, for example, the hairnet young girls place on their heads. This is 1,000 years or more than that back. This is back to the Gemara. Simply one who transfers urine that is 40 days old, Alexandrian knitter, soap, cremonia, ashlag, and all other cleansing agents, the amount necessary to wash a small garment. Quite interesting to hear what they use to clean. You wouldn't imagine. Again, what's a small garment? A hairnet that young girls place on their heads. The person who transfers herbs that are soaking would be enough to, again, these herbs that were soaked in order to use them as dyes. You would follow enough. It would need to be enough that you would be able to dye a sample for a weaver. Number 9, a person who transfers ink. Quite interesting. If the ink is already in the quill, then it needs to be enough ink that it'll be able to write 2 letters. That's considered significant. If, however, a person removes the concentrate used to make the ink, or the ink while it's still in the inkwell, then you need a larger amount because it's still the raw product, meaning the amount necessary for a person to dip the pen in and write 2 letters. If a person transfers enough ink to write 1 letter in an inkwell, so he's got his inkwell on the right, and on the left in his other hand, he has the actual ink inside of a quill, then there's a doubt whether the 2 add up or not, because they're 2 different types they're being held in 2 different ways. When a person takes out enough ink to write 2 letters and writes them while he's walking, so he's liable. Why? Because as you write, it's considered like you're putting them down. You're putting it down on the parchment. If a person takes out enough to write 1 letter and writes, and then takes out some more ink and writes it as well, then he's not liable. Why? Because it's like 2 separate activities, and each activity had less than the minimum amount required. Eye paint, whether it's for medical purposes or for cosmetic purposes, enough to paint an eye. But if it's a place where a woman would only paint both eyes or none, then it would be enough for 2 eyes. The person who takes out eye paint for cosmetic purposes is not liable unless he takes out a quantity of, that's what we just said, sorry, tar, sulfur, enough to make a hole. They would actually use the tar to shape the hole that they were pouring out of. Wax, enough to place in a small hole. They would use wax as plugs. Paste, meaning glue, enough to place on a board to catch birds. That doesn't sound nice. Fat, meaning like schmaltz, enough to grease a space the size of a cellar, which is a little coin under a cake. So that's what. Red clay, sufficient to make a seal for a letter. Other clay, enough to use it to make the opening of a crucible. Manure or fine sand, enough to fertilize a leek. Coarse sand, enough to mix with a full trowel of lime, firm clay, all different types of clay, enough to make the opening of a goldsmith's crucible, hair, enough to mix with clay to make the opening of a goldsmith's crucible, lime, which is what kids would apply to themselves in order to make their skin more red or white, enough to apply to a girl's smallest finger, dust or ash enough to cover the blood of a small bird, which is obviously a very small amount, but that's a mitzvah, so that makes it significant. A pebble, what's a pebble worth? Unfortunately, in this case, enough for an animal to feel it if it was thrown at it, which would be 10 zuzim. A shard, which is like a broken earthenware vessel, enough to contain about a revius, which according to Reb Chaim Nai is 86 mil. A rope, sufficient to make a handle for a container. Reeds, enough to make a hook to hang a sifter or a sieve in your kitchen. Palm leaves, enough to make a handle for an Egyptian basket. Palm bast, enough to use as a stopper for a pitcher of wine. Unprocessed wool, enough to make a little ball the size of a nut. Bone, enough to make a spoon. Glass, enough to sharpen the point of a weaver's needle or to cut 2 threads, meaning like a knife. These are all obviously very small amounts. 2 hairs from the tail of a horse or of a cow would be considered significant. What would they use that for? I've forgotten. To hunt birds, they would use hairs from a cow and horse tails. 1 bristle from a pig's back. This was used actually for sewing leather. That's already significant. Fibers from a date palm, 2. The bark of the date branch was 1. Cotton, silk, camel's wool, rabbit's wool, wool from an animal of the sea, or any other fibers that can be spun enough to spin a thread 4 handbreadths long. So that's about that long, about 40 centimeters, or a little less. Okay, if it's a cloth, a sack, or leather, then you would follow whatever we learn about ritual impurity. And when we come to ritual impurity, we'll discuss how large a piece of material needs to be in order to become tameh, and you would follow the same principles here, which would mean 3 handbreadths, about 30 centimeters for a cloth. Sackcloth, which is a little bit longer and more rough, would need to be about 40 centimeters, 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. Leather would need to be a little larger, 5 handbreadths for 5 handbreadths. Animal hides. So we're going to see over here that there are a whole lot of steps in the process of making leather. So if it hasn't been processed at all yet and it's still soft, I would have thought it's super hard then. But before you started working on it at all, it's still considered soft. Then it would be, what would a person use that for? You would use it to wrap a weight inside of it, the size of a shekel. Once it started being processed, it's been salted, but it hasn't yet had flour and gold juice applied to it. That's step 2 in making leather. Then it would be enough to make an amulet. Once the flour has been applied to it, but not the gold nut juice, the measure would be enough to write a get on it. If it's been processed entirely, its measure is 5 handbreadths by 5 handbreadths, which we said in the previous halacha. Okay, processed parchment. Meaning once it becomes parchment, sufficient to write the passage from Shema till Vishorecha, the first paragraph of the Shema. Dursustus, which is the other part of the parchment, the skin actually gets divided into 2 parts and they could both be made into parchment. Dursustus is used for a mezuzah, so it needs to be large enough to write a mezuzah. Paper, enough to write on it 2 letters for a customs officer's receipt. All I would need is 2 letters to say whether it is tax deductible or not, or it's taxed or not. These 2 letters are larger than the letters we usually write with, what the tax officers would use. Person who transfers a customs officer's receipt is liable, even though he has already shown it to the customs officer and they've already let him through, still he'll need that as proof. So that's still significant. Promissory note that's been paid, or a paper that has been erased, enough to wrap her. So if it's been paid, it's useless because you've gotten your money back already. You don't need it anymore. Or if it's paper that there's nothing on it, so then it would be enough to wrap around a small flask of perfume. If it has some clean paper large enough to write, then it would be enough to write 2 custom officials' letters. An animal, a wild beast, a fowl, even if it is still alive, he's liable for carrying it. But if a person carries a person, he's not liable. Why? Very interesting. Meaning that a living person carries himself. So as long as the person is alive, it's considered that you and him carried him together. Since each of you didn't carry the person alone, it was a joint operation, therefore neither of you are liable, because we've learned earlier that you're only liable if you do something that one person can't do by himself. But if the person is sick or tied up, then he's not able to carry himself, and you would be liable for carrying him. A woman, this is a very practical one, a woman may walk her son if you can pick up one foot and place down the other. So if you're staying in, I don't know, let's say you're in Skakusa in the Kruger for Shabbos, and you've rented two huts, one for you and one for your brother's family, and you want to go to each other for the Shabbos meal, but there's no Erev, and you have a child that's just learning to walk. So once the child is a good enough walker that if you pick up his one foot, he's not going to topple, then you'd actually be able to walk him from the one hut to the other so he can join you in your Shabbos meal. A person who transfers a living child with a purse hanging around him, so the person you're not liable for because he's a person, but the purse you would be liable for because the purse doesn't carry itself, so you would be liable because the purse has nothing to do with the kid that it's around. The kid, a little baby, doesn't generally go around with a purse. But if one transfers an adult who's wearing clothes, even if he's got rings, then you wouldn't be liable because that's all secondary to the person, which is another very interesting halacha in Shabbos of purpose, that you can have something that's got a lot of weight, but if it's secondary to something else, then it doesn't take on its independence. That obviously is also a lesson that sometimes it's important for us not to be caught up in our own weight, but to be able to serve a greater purpose. If by contrast his garments were folded and held on his shoulder, then the person would be liable for carrying the person and the garments, because obviously those garments are not secondary to him. Number 18. We're almost done. A person who transfers locusts, live locust, even the smaller size, is liable because it's alive, it's an independent entity. If it's dead, then it would be the amount of a dried fig. Actually, according to the Torah, certain locusts are kosher, although most of us have lost the tradition which ones they are. A bird of the vineyards, one is liable for transferring even the smallest amount, even if it's dead. Why? Because people would actually use these little birds for medicinal purposes, which means it's significant, at least in their eyes. Same applies in all other instances. The minimum measure for which one is liable for transferring a human corpse or flesh of a human corpse, or the carcass of an animal, a dead crawling animal, is the same as the minimum amount, again, when we talk about impurity. A human corpse or an animal corpse would be the size of an olive, a crawling animal the size of a lentil. Let's move on from that fast. If there's, this is an interesting halacha, if there's exactly an olive-sized portion of animal carcass in one place, meaning that it's enough to cause the room to become tamei, impure, and you remove only a part of that measurement, then you're liable because that's significant, because you've just caused the room to no longer become impure because you've deducted from the minimal amount. That's if there was exactly an olive size and you deducted. But if there was 1.5 olive sizes and you removed the half, then obviously that's irrelevant because there's still the room is still impure. And it would go with any other instances. When would that apply? That a person is liable only when he transfers the minimum of a standard measure of a substance. When the person transfers the substance without any specific intent. So this is now going on in everything we've learned. We've just given the defaults. However, if a person transfers a seed in order to sow, or a substance for medicinal purposes to show as an example, then he would be liable for the slightest amount. So if you're looking for a sample to show to one of your customers, even though it wouldn't be functional, but for you right now it is functional because it's serving a purpose, and therefore you would be liable. Should a person who stores a substance to use as a seed or for medicinal purposes or to be shown as a sample forget why he actually had it? He forgot, was he using it for a sample, which would mean that he's liable even the slightest amount, or for another purpose? And now he doesn't remember, now he's moved it. So he would be liable regardless of his size, because his original intention was for that, and he didn't change his intention, he just forgot what it was. But for anybody else, they wouldn't be liable because that's not what the intention was. If after transferring the article for the intent that the person had, the person chucks it into a storeroom, even if it is set aside in a distinct place, then that nullifies his original intent, and at this point we would follow the defaults. Number 22, when an entity is not usually stored away, nor is it fit to be stored away. For example, a discharge, if a person would store it away, it would show that this is significant to him, he's breaking the norm, he's breaking the default, then he would be liable. But for anybody else, they wouldn't be liable because this is an article that generally is discarded and therefore has no significance. Because you're only liable if you're carrying something that is not completely just discardable. It's an item that's kept. Person who transfers a half of the prescribed measure is not liable. Similarly, a person who performs half a malacha is not liable. So if you do half of a forbidden activity, you're not liable. If a person transfers half the prescribed measure, puts it down, and then takes the second half and carries that, he is liable. They combine. However, if he picks up the first half before putting down the second, then he is not liable because it's as if the first half has been perished, it's burned, it's lost. When a person transfers half of the prescribed measure of a substance, places it down, and then returns and transfers the second half, passing it over the first half, the moment it passes over the first half in close proximity, then they get combined. It's as if it's already landed and he's liable. But if he throws it, he's not liable unless it rests near the first substance. When a person transfers half the prescribed measure and afterwards transfers another half to the same domain in one period of lack of knowledge, then he's liable. However, if he transfers the two measures to two different domains, if there is a domain in between them for which one would be liable, then that divides the two. And so you've done two half activities that don't come together. And so you're not liable. But if there's only a karmelis, which is only rabbinically forbidden between the two, then the two activities would combine and you would be liable. When a person transfers less than the prescribed measurement, and then so he started by less than, let's say, a date of food, and then while he was carrying it, it expanded. And now it is the size that he's liable for. So he's not liable, or the reverse. If it was the prescribed measure, but before he put it down, it shrunk, again, he wouldn't be liable, but yeah. The person transfers a portion of a food the size of a dried fig with the intent of eating it. But before he put it down, it shrunk. And then he decided to use it instead for sewing or medicinal purposes where there's a smaller amount. He's still liable because although it shrunk together with his intention. His intention also shrunk. Before he only wanted a larger volume, which is for eating, and now he wants a smaller volume for the other purpose. If a person transfers a quantity of seeds smaller than the size of dried fig with the intent of sowing them, which would make him liable, but before he put them down, he decided that he's going to eat them, then he's not liable. If the seeds swell in size before they are placed down and reach the size of a dried fig, before he changes his mind and decides to eat them, he is still liable because although he's decided to use a larger amount, the amount increased too, it grew. Even if he had not changed his mind, he would still have been liable because of his original intent. So he started off liable on one account because he was taking a small amount to sow, and he ended up liable on another account because he's taking a larger amount to eat. Okay, we're not too bad with time. We're just about done. If a person took a little bit of food with the intent of eating it, and then it shrunk and then regrew before he put it down, so there's debate over here. Does the fact that in the meantime it shrunk mean that he's no longer liable, or is he still liable? When a person throws a portion of food the size of an olive into a house that is impure, and by doing so makes that house now have enough, a large enough quantity that it can contract impurity. So again, there's a question whether he's liable or not, because that completed the measurement or not. And finally, in 28, the person who transfers less than the standard measurement of a substance is not liable even though he transfers it in a container. That's a fascinating one. So if you've got a big dish and inside that dish is just one seed, then you're not liable because the dish is secondary to the seed. That's obviously provided that the reason you're carrying the dish is to move the seed. Accordingly, if a person transfers a man who is alive and who is not bound on a bed, he's not liable, even though he's carrying a whole big piece of furniture. The bed is secondary to the man that is carrying. So this would be relevant if, let's say, somebody is sick and they want to be transferred and there's no Erev. So you would be allowed to take him with his whole bed, biblically speaking, and maybe even rabbinically speaking, because he's sick, because the bed is secondary to him. The person who transfers a perfumer's box is liable only on a single offering, although it contains many different types of scents, because they're all considered one item. If he transfers several items in his hand, he is liable only for a single sin. So this would be relevant if you're planning on, in case you need to go to the hospital for childbirth on Shabbos. So, and there's going to be several articles that you'll need. So before Shabbos, you pack all the articles into one bag so that when you need to carry it, you're not doing multiple malachas, but you're just doing one malacha. Thank you so much for staying strong and joining us even as we go through these rather advanced and detailed sections of the Rambam.